Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree. I'm Julia Fisher and this is the programme that brings you the stories of believers in Jesus living in Israel and the West Bank today. So come with me to Tel Aviv to meet a Jewish man from India. His name is Schmuel Salway and he's the associate pastor at a Messianic congregation called Dugit. As with most Jewish people, he has a fascinating story to tell. And here he begins by explaining more about his Indian roots.
Yes, my parents are Indian Jews who immigrated to Israel in the early 70s. I was born and raised here in Israel.
It might come as quite a surprise to some of our listeners that there are a community of Indian Jews. Was it a very big one?
Yes, there was a relatively big community in central India. There's several Indian Jewish communities in India, and my mother comes from a central area called next to Bombay, from Pune, and for many years they have been keeping their Jewishness there. I was actually able to visit there a few years back, and they have a Torah scroll that's around 800 years. I was able to do a little root search and find out the synagogue my grandfather went to. He actually has his name inscribed there in the synagogue, and meet the Jewish community. Currently, most of the Jews have immigrated to Israel. There's very, very few Jews left in India, but the synagogues are still there. They're not as splendid as they used to be. You have to use your imagination because they're a little broken down. But it just shows signs of big synagogues and a big Jewish community. Most of them have immigrated to Israel.
So when did they come to Israel? Did they come mostly all together?
There were several big immigrations. My mom came as part of the big one. At the end of the 60s, her family all immigrated to Israel with other Jewish families in the neighborhood.
Now, presumably, they were religious Jews.
They were religious, but not in the way you see it right now with black hats and stuff. It was very important in the exile to keep the Jewishness, so they had to fight. They were try to keep the Torah, try to keep intermarriage, try to keep Shabbat when they were away. So it's important for them, their Jewishness. So when they immigrated to Israel, they brought with them a lot of very strict Jewish rules with them back to the land. So they were not religious as you see the religious people right now dressed up, but they were very, very conservative Jews.
Now, you are a Messianic Jewish believer, so you are bucking the trend.
Yes, it was actually my mother who came to faith through a women's Bible study group, but her family being very conservative, they were very opposed. It came out of a lot of ignorance. They didn't know what it meant to be a Messianic Jew. They thought she was converted to Christianity and she's become a Christian. And for many years they were taught to stay away from it. And the threats were that if you convert to any other religion, whether in India it's Hinduism or Christianity or being a Muslim, you'll be disowned by your family. So when she came to faith, they decided as a family to disown her. The grandfather, who had a great say, said, "You are like dead to us. We want nothing to do with you. You and your family. Nobody in the family was supposed to allowed to talk to my family. They never met many of us. The kids. I have 3 sisters and me, and many of my family. They live a little bit more than an hour away, and they've never actually met us. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and I went there with my mother to support her in the funeral because she decided to go, even though she wasn't invited. She just heard about it, and I decided to go with her and support her. And I watched my family, my grandma, in tears, walk by us, and my aunts and uncles and cousins and nephews, and they didn't even say hello, not to my mom. And I can imagine how painful it was for her. It was painful for me without knowing them, but my mother, she actually knew her brothers and sisters, and she decided to follow Yeshua, follow Jesus, and if it meant giving up her family, that's the sacrifice she was willing to make.
It's a very big cost, isn't it?
I think that's what really. When I was growing up, I didn't really care about God. Tel Aviv is a very secular city. I was interested in studies, in school, in sports, and I just didn't really think about God. Didn't really think about Yeshua, about Jesus making a commitment. And I think when I was 16, I really had an encounter. I was invited to a conference, and there was a guest speaker. I don't really remember what he spoke about, but I went forward. They asked people who wanted to receive Yeshua, Jesus, into their heart to come forward. And I was all the way in the back, and I was hanging out in the back, just meeting. I went to this conference just to meet with friends, and I said, "There's no way I'm going up to the front. I'm too cool for this. People will see me. It's in public." And but I really felt God driving me to come to the front of the room. And I said, "There's no way I'm doing it." And I actually held on to the chair, literally waited for the conference to be over, the meeting to be over. And when everybody was gone, I said, "Thank God!" And I ran outside, and I said, "If that is God, then I don't need God." And so I went home, and went straight to bed, put the cover over my head, and I started weeping and crying. And I'm an Israeli young man. I don't usually cry. I don't know how it is in other places of the world, but it was very special. I cried and wept, and I just knew it was God. And I asked for forgiveness and all the things. I really know how to give my life to Yeshua, but anything I do, I brought together, prayed. And that's when I started my relationship with Yeshua. And what really challenged me was there must be a God. There must be something to this faith in Yeshua and Jesus, because why else would my mother, I saw how painful it was for her leaving her parents. Why else would my mother do that if there was nothing really, if it was just an idea or a concept? There has to be something more there. And that's when I really started reading more into the New Testament, really trying to figure out what this faith is about and why people would change their lives for an idea. It's either God is real or not, and I had to find for myself, and that's what really challenged me. My mom's testimony really encouraged me to seek, and I started reading and the Bible more, trying to really understand what it meant to be a believer. At the age of 18, I joined the army, the Israeli army. Everybody in Israel, boys go for 3 years and girls go for 2 years, and I went to the army. I was a combat medic in Lebanon, and there were summer camps, and they needed summer camps in Israel because of situation. We're surrounded by countries that are not very friendly towards us. In trips, we need armed escorts. If it's a youth group or a kids camp, there needs to be somebody with a gun to escort, and a medic if somebody gets injured. So I was a combat medic. I had both medical training, and I had a gun. I could escort camping trips. So they would ask me to come and escort camping trips. So this is when I was 18. Starting age of 16, I committed my life to the Lord, but I wasn't really on fire for God. I just was it was between me and God and our relationship. And when I was 18, I started going to summer camps. I started being a counselor, assistant counselor in these camps, and the youth would come up to me and ask me questions. They asked me questions about all sorts of things, and they would say, "I have a girlfriend or I have a boyfriend. He's not a believer in Yeshua. Is that okay?" And I would just say, "Well, not really, because it says so in the Bible somewhere," not knowing exactly where it was. So I would go home from camp and read up and try to come more prepared for the next time. But they'd ask me more questions. My father or my mother, they passed away. They don't know Yeshua. They don't know God. Are they going to heaven or not? And so I'd be challenged by the youth themselves. They would ask me a lot of hard questions, and I was challenged to really know the Bible more have a real relationship, because kids are real. They know if you just talk the talk or if you walk the walk. And I decided to really commit my life to the Lord, live the life of a believer, really know what the Bible says about these things, really hear from God and have a real live relationship with God. And I've been working with youth since I was 18 for many years now. I still help in youth camps. I still have a youth group. I'm the youth pastor in our congregation, as well as the associate pastor.
When you came out of the army, what did you do?
After the army, I just did what everybody else in Israel did. I started going to university. I studied in Tel Aviv University and also in Jerusalem University, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I started working as the airport authority in security. So I started working in airport authorities for several years. Then I started working for El Al. El Al is the Israeli Airlines. And I even worked for El Al in New York City. So I lived in New York in the Upper East Side in Manhattan for 3 years, worked for the Israeli security there for El Al Airlines, and also for the Israeli consulate. So I worked for Israeli consulate doing different missions for the Israeli consulate in the security area as security officer. But I always knew my calling was to come back to the land of Israel and serve God.
Schmuel Salway sharing his interesting life story. And we'll hear more from Schmuel on next week's programme, when he'll be describing more about his work in Tel Aviv. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. And the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, PO Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.